Sure, there are lots of theories about solutions for diabetes, but in all these years, has anything been proven? Well, yes, it has, and it all started with one small but very bright man. If you've watched this channel very much, you've heard me and others make references to Dr. Richard Bernstein. In my mind, he is the ultimate expert on diabetes. And today we're going to talk about him, about his book Diabetes Solution, and about his approach to beating, or as he would put it, managing diabetes very well. As Babe Ruth was to baseball, and Michael Jordan was to basketball, and Jack Nicklaus was to golf, and Tom Brady is to American football, Dr. Richard Bernstein is to thoroughly beating diabetes. The first thing you need to know is that Dr. Bernstein is himself a diabetic. In fact, he is a type 1 diabetic, and he has been one since the age of 12 back in the 1940s. Dr. Bernstein still practices medicine, and at the time of this video, he's around 87 years old. By the conventional wisdom of those early days, he should have been dead 70 years ago. Instead, Dr. Bernstein goes on and on and on. He keeps his blood glucose levels in the 80s nearly all the time, and his A1C is always in the 4s. As a type 1 diabetic, he must take insulin, of course, but he takes far less insulin to maintain his perfectly normal glucose levels than most type 1s take just to keep their A1C under 9 or 10. Now, because I've talked about Dr. Bernstein in other videos, I won't go into length about how he came to understand how to control his blood sugar, but I will say this. His chief instrument for knowing what he knows and being able to help so many thousands of diabetics is the blood sugar meter. Once he got his first blood sugar meter, way back in 1969, he was on the way to victory. It took him about 3 or 4 years of experimenting with that primitive 3-pound glucometer before the light came on. Along with his testing, he read an article which described how animals were able to reverse diabetic complications when researchers kept their glucose levels at a normal range. He showed his doctor the article, and he was told disparagingly, animals are not humans, and besides, it's impossible to normalize human blood sugars. Dr. Bernstein was undeterred. He wrote, "Since I was desperate, I had no choice but to pretend I was an animal." He began to test his glucose like crazy, and he came to realize what everybody realizes who tests their blood sugar levels frequently, and that is that carbohydrates raise glucose far more than fats or proteins. This is indisputable. And when you cut down on eating carbohydrates, glucose control becomes fairly simple. But on the other hand, if you eat lots of carbs, glucose control is impossible. He noticed this phenomenon over and over again. The more carbs he ate, the wilder his glucose swings. The less carbs he ate, the more his glucose levels stayed in a decent and stable range. Now, Dr. Bernstein was a type 1, so he was taking insulin. He had to do that. But he discovered that even with prodigious amounts of insulin, high-carb meals were impossible to manage. He would either see his glucose rise up way too high by not giving himself enough pre-meal insulin, or he'd see it plunging way too low as a result of giving himself too much insulin. He soon recognized that there was no way around this. The only possible way to keep his glucose levels in a normal range and stable was to eat very low-carb meals. But to his delight, he saw that these low-carb meals worked beautifully. He wrote about his meal and testing experiments, saying, "If a change brought an improvement, I would retain it. If it made the blood sugar worse, I would discard it." Within a year, I had refined my insulin and diet regimen to the point that I had essentially normal blood sugars around the clock. I had taught myself how to make my blood sugar levels whatever I wanted them to be and was no longer on the roller coaster. Things were under my control. Bernstein was ecstatic. He began to write articles and try to get them into the medical journals, but nobody was interested. He was an engineer, not a doctor, and what he was advocating, which was precise control over glucose for diabetics, was considered heresy in those days. Finally, he gave in, went to medical school, and became a doctor. But all his training as a doctor did not change his mind about blood sugar control. His diabetic complications had been terrible. Frozen shoulders, infections, night blindness, failing kidneys, kidney stones, numbness in the feet, and more. And now these miseries had magically disappeared, and he was not about to allow medical orthodoxy to convince him to go back to that standard low-fat, high-carb diet which had failed so miserably in his own life. He hoped he could convert the entire medical field to his low-carb, frequent testing approach, but the experts met his enthusiastic reports and his many attempts to get published in medical journals with a great big yawn. Finally, out of frustration, he went to medical school, he became a doctor, and he opened a clinic and began attacking diabetes one patient at a time. As his successes multiplied, even the experts were forced to listen and consider what he had to say, but it was still an uphill battle. One of the incidents in Dr. Bernstein's life which indicates just how unique and courageous he is involves a medical convention that he attended. A speaker was discussing diabetes and rhetorically asked the question, well, we all know diabetics cannot hope to achieve the same range of blood sugars as normal people, right? He asked this, confident that his audience of medical professionals would all surely agree and would consider this point very obvious. In fact, the speaker wanted to push his point even further and ask, is there anyone here who does not believe this? Well, of course, nobody raised their hand, except Dr. Richard Bernstein, who then proceeded to tell his peers what he'd been able to do in his own life as a type 1 diabetic, which was to keep his glucose levels at a normal range. This was a testimony that could not be denied, and no one really knew what to say about it. As a doctor, Richard Bernstein was confronted with type 2 diabetics as well as type 1s. He knew low-carb was the perfect solution for the type 1 diabetic, and he soon realized that the same low-carb regimen works beautifully for type 2s. As a type 1, he had to take fast and slow-acting insulin to mimic his broken pancreas. Type 2 diabetics usually don't have to take insulin, but he discovered their diabetes essentially disappears, or at least goes into remission as long as they eat a very low-carb diet. In their case, their pancreas puts out the necessary insulin, and it is a whole lot easier for a type 2's pancreas to cover 30 grams of carbs a day rather than the 300 grams of carbs per day which so many people eat, as they devour daily mountains of bread, chips, pasta, potatoes, snacks, pastries, and the like. Bernstein was soon helping type 2s to see the same victory over diabetes and diabetic complications that he as a type 1 had seen, using the exact same approach, minus the insulin shots in most cases. In 1996, Dr. Bernstein published his famous Diabetes Solution book, which has truly been a revolutionary handbook, and this is one of the many, many thousands of copies, if not millions, that have been printed. I want to share a few quotes from this book with you. I must warn you that this book is not easy reading. Dr. Bernstein is a highly intelligent man, and he writes that way. He answers questions most of us don't even have enough sense to ask, and he sometimes uses terms most of us have never heard. So I will not tell you this book is a quick, easy read. But if you're willing to read it carefully and think through what he's saying, you can learn a lot. At the beginning of the book, Dr. Bernstein opens by saying this: I developed diabetes at the age of 12, and for more than 2 decades I was an ordinary diabetic, dutifully following doctor's orders and leading the most normal life I could. Over the years, the complications from my diabetes became worse and worse. Well, of course, that is typical diabetes. It's chronic, it's progressive. You take your meds, you get worse, and your complications get worse. And that was his situation for 20 years, until the light came on when he managed to get his hands on a glucometer and began to find out how his body reacted to various foods. And one of Bernstein's key findings was that many of the so-called natural foods raised blood sugar about as high as the snack and candy items that everybody agreed was evil. In his section on carbohydrates, he writes, "Sugar, you might ask, holding up a slice of coarse ground bread? This is sugar?" Then he writes, "In a word, yes, at least after you digest it. With some important exceptions, carbohydrates are foods derived primarily from plant sources, such as vegetables, grains, and fruits, have the same effect on blood glucose levels that table sugar does. Whether you eat a piece of the nuttiest whole grain bread, drink a Coke, or have a dollop of mashed potatoes, the effect on blood glucose levels is the same. Blood sugar rises fast." Now, how in the world did Bernstein come up with this idea? Did he get it from a dream that he had? Or was it the result of having discussions with various thinkers and philosophers, and after a long debate he came to believe this? No, it wasn't nearly that complicated. Bernstein simply tested his blood sugar before and after eating various foods again and again and again, and he consistently came up with the same conclusion. Starches, grains, and fruits raise blood sugar nearly as fast as table sugar or candy bars or apple pie. And anyone with diabetes or pre-diabetes who tests their blood sugar will see that exact same thing happening over and over and over again. And when you start seeing that and you keep seeing it, well, eventually you just have to believe it, just the way I did with Mike the Meter. In an interview, Dr. Bernstein was asked the cause of diabetes complications and kidney problems and infections and amputations and all the other issues. Bernstein answered, the simple answer, elevated blood sugars. And the secondary answer is that some studies have shown that wide swings in blood sugars can also be a cause of diabetic complications. There have over the years been a number of so-called authorities, including organizations, claiming that the complications of diabetes are caused by the disease diabetes and they're unrelated to blood sugar. This is false, and it's been promoted mostly because many physicians do not know how to keep blood sugars normal. I want to highlight the second part of his answer. Dr. Bernstein says that wide swings in blood sugar can be a cause of diabetic complications. He has even said that huge spikes and plummets, up and down in blood sugar, may prove worse for you than consistently elevated blood sugar. And of course, that's exactly what you get, huge blood sugar swings when you eat the standard high-carb diet. And that's true even if it is a whole food plant-based diet. If it's high carb, your glucometer will almost surely reveal you're getting tremendous swings in your blood sugar from day to day and even from hour to hour. And if your average glucose isn't too bad, those swings will surely cause you problems sooner or later. Let's look at this graphic I found on Facebook. The person who posted this says I was labeled a brittle diabetic, which basically meant I was eating the diet the NHS recommended, low GI and lots of carbs. Now that I've changed and implemented Dr. Bernstein's scientific approach to managing my diabetes, I'm suddenly not brittle. Amazing how a change in diet from high carb to low carb can stabilize and lower glucose levels. And how do we know that? How do we know it does that? Should we just take Dr. Bernstein's word for it? No. All you need to do is go out to your pharmacy and buy a $20 glucose meter and some testing strips and figure it out for yourself. Mike the Meter will agree with Dr. Richard Bernstein because that's how Bernstein figured things out, by listening to Mike's great-grandpa, Matthew the Meter. One radical statement is found in the early pages of this book by one of Dr. Bernstein's patients who found victory over diabetes. He says, Dr. Bernstein made it clear that for diabetics to control their disease, they need to know as much as their doctors did about the disease. Well, I don't know if that's entirely true, but I like the thought that we can't just pick a doctor out of the telephone book, go to him with our diabetes, and simply do what he says. After all, it is your body and your life that's on the line, and we need to research and read and think and test our blood sugar and pray until we figure out what's happening and what we can do about it. Hopefully, you'll find a great doctor who will encourage you to test your glucose, not only in the morning, but an hour or two after meals to see what various foods and meals are doing to you. And who knows, you may be the next Dr. Bernstein for the next generation.